Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Gracelin Baskaran. I'm the director for the Project on Critical Mineral Security at CSIS. The current race for critical minerals spans supply chains across the world. As we strengthen our resilience against China, the U.S. is turning to resource-rich emerging markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is requiring us to engage on a front that historically we haven't through commercial diplomacy. I'm thrilled today to be joined by the Special Coordinator for the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, Helaina Matza, so we can dive into this further. Helaina, thank you for joining us.
Gracelin, thank you so much for having me.
So we haven't historically engaged in a lot of these emerging markets in a commercial sense before. How do you see PGI's role in building secure critical mineral supply chains?
It's a great question, and I might just take a step back and talk a little bit about how the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment came to be. So earlier in the administration, President Biden wanted to think of ways that we internationalize all the great work we were doing here in our own economy as we were passing the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IRA. There was a huge impetus to think through how we inject that type of investment and energy into the partner countries around the world, especially as we're working so closely with them to decarbonize, and as we were all collectively looking at these constraints in global supply chains. It was clear, while we wanted to bring a lot home, that there was always going to be a role for the rest of the world. And to do that in a way that allowed everyone to participate was really important to him. And so when he brought the concept to the G7, really because this is one of those things you just really can't do alone for it to be totally effective, it started with a goal, a top-line goal, for us to collectively mobilize $600 billion by 2027 to close the infrastructure gap in emerging markets. And something we really learned quickly is that you can't look at one part of an emerging economy or any economy in a vacuum. And so we looked across the infrastructure sectors and said we have to look at several of them at the same time. And so we're thinking about the digital ecosystem, the physical infrastructure that connects all of that together, rail, ports, how do we bring down logistics costs, how do we commercialize the real drivers of economic growth. Then that takes us to clean energy. And we really look at that as an end-to-end solution. So we're not only thinking about solar and wind deployment, we're thinking about the upstream implications, whether they go into clean energy technologies, electrification, or the semiconductor industry. We understand that they're all connected. And so that was really how we entered the world in how we were doing this evolvement in our economic policy, which has always been centered around, capacity development, supporting our partners' growth. But now, with an inclusion of these deeper investments, trying to bring in not only more concessional capital, but ultimately to drive private capital into these projects in a way that could be more inclusive, but also more results driven. So you can see what you're building and how that connects to the global economy.
That's really helpful. So one of your previous roles was as the Director of Energy Transformation and as a Senior Advisor for Critical Minerals. So you've kind of been embedded. One of the things that I found really interesting that you said at COP last year was that most people in critical minerals started as energy professionals, and then we realized that critical minerals is a bedrock for the energy sector. How did your experience in that role inform what you're working on right now?
Yeah, so I think we even have to go back another 2 roles before then. I started my career as a sustainability advisor, then became a climate negotiator, then worked on clean energy deployment at large, both at the State Department and at the White House. And in between, really came to understand the role that critical minerals are going to play in our ability to reach those goals. And so I always joke, it's unbelievable that you see climate professionals, people that are fighting for decarbonization around the world, now sitting in the bottom of open pit mines, trying to figure out how you connect all of that, right, from end to end. And looking backwards, it seems like this is perfect evolution, but really on each stage of that journey, you kind of had no idea where it was going to take you. But it's just so clear, and something that I learned through my own personal evolution, that you can't pick these issues apart. And you're seeing more around the world climate-driven critical mineral funds, right, to try to help deployment of processing technologies around the world, or even like greenfield exploration with cool new technologies that are helping us do more prospecting in a least damaging way, right? So while I feel lucky to be maybe earlier to the game than others, the world is catching up and making these really important connections.
So we were just talking about kind of your experience working in emerging markets prior to this starting across the world, right? You've been in the Philippines working, you've been in Brazil, you've been in Angola, the DRC. How is PGI fostering that engagement and collaboration in these markets, which again, the United States has long kind of engaged with these markets through an aid perspective, sometimes national security. But how is PGI driving that next front of commercial diplomacy and really holistic economic development, investment, and job creation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you named a lot of the areas or geographical areas that we decided to focus on. And if you think about them all together, they share some commonalities, right? One, very important national security partners that have been asking us to expand the scope of our work, right? And I know that's hard to say for the whole continent of Africa, but we can zero in on where we at least initially started working. But in the case of the Philippines, our Western Hemisphere work, our Central Asia work, it was clear that there was a need to kind of evolve our relationship, to have this additional component, as to the point you made, beyond just aid, and certainly beyond capacity development, although it's really important. And we have a very long legacy of helping countries, write the laws for their regulatory reform, all the efforts that you do to create the enabling environment to bring in private investment. But, we're hearing our partners, especially across the global south, saying that's great, but we also need investment today. So how can we do a better job running those two tracks in parallel and maybe connecting the regulatory reform, the new mining codes we're writing, all of that work directly to unlocking specific projects? And so it was with that ethos that we really try to select where we're going and where we're going to spend our time. And maybe the work that we've been doing on the Trans-Africa Corridor, sorting in Lobito, is the best example. This really not only started in the context of PGI, but also upon the reflections of our Africa Leader Summit, which we hosted very early in the administration and got a lot of this feedback from leaders around the world. Many of those leaders restructuring outstanding debt, having issues getting their next tranche of World Bank, IFC funding because they're going through that restructuring process, needing private investment, but not having the right capital markets to attract that investment at rates that would allow that work to happen. So very interesting sweet spot where you still needed some concessional capital, but it couldn't go against the balance sheet of those countries. So how do you develop an approach that brings all those pieces together and makes those projects near commercial? And we had an amazing opportunity as our relationship continued to evolve in a very positive way with Angola. I think you can look at the US-Angola relationship and say, wow, that is something that couldn't have changed more drastically in a short period of time. And while there's always work to be done, working with President Lorenzo on that development and adding that economic piece has been a very productive process. And so zeroing in there really as the beachhead helped us understand how we can help promote more connectivity across the continent. And what we did was, we didn't just say one project here, one project there, one tool. We listened to the leaders. We listened to their regional desire for a couple things. One, to be more regionally connected. And that's a huge issue for some of those countries that are landlocked, that like to use, and I agree, the terminology, they won't be land linked. They want that to be an advantage. Countries like Angola and others that want to develop their connection to global markets, to be able to take advantage of additional directions into the US and European markets. So how do you do that? Well, this is where infrastructure is really important. And if you take a look at the rail network and connectivity in the continent through Southern Africa, you had a couple pieces that were already built but needed some serious refurbishment, and then clearly a middle piece that needed to have new investment in real connectivity. Greenfield rail, which is one of the hardest things to figure out how to invest in. And so, we can dive into this as deeply as you want, but ultimately over the course of 18 months, working with our partners, we selected a handful of projects that we thought our tools could work for, that had private partners on the front end to help us do a lot of things. We refurbished the Benguela rail line with the support of a Western consortium and with our Development Finance Corporation providing those loans. XM in that period of time made the largest commitment we've ever made on the continent, over $1 billion for new solar deployment in Angola, new microgrid programs on the way, and thinking through what that expansion can look like as we promote that electricity connection to connect to some of the other regions, including towards the DRC and Zambia that desperately need those resources as they're developing their adjacent economies and mining sectors. We have done what I think has captured the imagination and maybe a little skepticism of the world of our first greenfield rail project that I'd love to kind of dive in with you a bit. And did that with a private partner, European investors, US, and figured out a way to develop a path that can allow commercial partners to work alongside public partners, including the AFDB, the Africa Development Finance Bank, and many others. And so you see these projects, 4 or 5, ultimately layered on top of each other. They're doing 2 things that are pretty amazing. One, they're optimizing both the commerciality of the copper cobalt belts with the connectivity and resilience that we all want to see. We want to see products just as much moving to the east. We want to see them moving to the west. We want there to be opportunities for those products to be beneficiated on the continent and reach global markets. And so you need to invest in those routes. It also makes investing in that underlying infrastructure quite a bit more easy because you already know that there are commodities that could utilize that. But maybe more exciting than anything, how do you make that a value-driven approach, right? This is not an extractive play, although I know that's part of the kind of conversation out there. It's an economic growth play and a supply chain resiliency play, right? And those 2 things can live in the same place. They should live in the same place. And so what we are learning is as we are starting to invest in ways to bring down the time it takes to move products. So we already had first shipments moving on the Benguela line. You know, they move in a couple days, reached, in this case, the Port of Baltimore in 6 days. We have a greenfield rail that will bring down the time of transit from sometimes what has been on average 45 days, but could be months if you're having an issue crossing those borders, down to something that could happen in 36 hours. That means so much for other markets. And we're already seeing agribusiness and developers thinking about how they are booking capacity on these rail lines from Angola into the continent, right? And making investments on siloing and warehousing and cold storage as we're connecting our programs together, including the work that MCC and others will do on feeder roads in these countries, connecting farm blocks by the Zambezi River in Zambia and in areas in Angola, and new production hubs in DRC. It gives a greater degree of certainty to those private partners that this industry can take hold because those products can reach the markets that they need to.
So one of the fascinating things I think that you hit on is kind of the whole ecosystem, what it takes for development, right? So I'm thinking about a continent in the context of Africa that has 75% of the world's population without energy, right? And thinking about the lack of infrastructure. I remember back when I was at the World Bank, we looked at the per kilometer cost of transportation in Central Africa, kind of part of the, including the DRC. It's the highest in the world by a multiplier, which actually raises the overall cost of doing business, becomes a bit of a barrier to investment if I know that I'm gonna have these massive transport backlogs, as you said, at the border. The customs infrastructure isn't there. The ports are struggling. I always say I think South Africa is a great example of what happens when rail doesn't work, is mining companies are leaving because they're going, I'm losing hundreds of millions, per month just because I can't get it to the port. So really that whole ecosystem, I think, is particularly important. Now, a little bit of a hot question. So one of the things is China has obviously had a decades-long advantage because in a way, infrastructure was a bedrock of their foreign policy, acknowledging the soft power benefits it gave them, which in turn gave them access to markets, it gave them preferential access to minerals. So there's a lot of talk about the Belt and Road Initiative and is this a counter to the BRI? How do you view that kind of debate? I'm very curious. We're looking at we're talking about multiple rail lines, right? The Chinese have the rail line to Tanzania, right? We're going the other way, which personally I think is really important because it allows countries to sell to new markets. And we know that one source of investment and one source of offtake for agriculture, for minerals, for really any textiles, is dangerous because when you have an economic shock, it backfires on these countries. One of the things some of these presidents recently said at the China-Africa Cooperation Summit was, our trade deficit is a problem, right? We're importing a lot, but we're not exporting, so we're in the negative. How do you view this in terms of that kind of, there's a lot of rhetoric on the like China versus US.
Yeah, look, I mean, I just came back the other week from Tanzania having those questions or those conversations with Tanzanian officials of how do you actually benefit from having more investors interested in your market to raise the bar of what you're asking for from everyone. And I think that's really always been the US government policy and perspective. We talked for years about raising the bar, having world-class investors in these markets, improving enabling environment. And as I said earlier, now we're understanding that while we do that work, we have to bring those companies along like in real time. And I think that's a huge opportunity, whether you call emerging markets, global south. I know we keep trying to changing the term or phrase, but these are growth economies that have a huge opportunity to participate in what's next, right, for the world, for the energy transition, for AI, for global electrification. One of the fastest growing parts of the world. It's an amazing opportunity. And they, frankly, I might get my hand slapped for this, they should leverage the multiple interest and take those values that other countries like ours are bringing into the types of investments we're making and demand exactly the same from others. And so, to me, an ideal outcome is few things. One, we really do want more resiliency in these supply chains. It's important for the supply chain shocks in those countries, but it's also for the global economy. And if we ever learned that, it's been over the course of the last 4 years, from 2020 to 2024, we've learned so much about our interconnectivity, right? And where we can have real challenges. And now we're doing that, understanding that, while the world is changing faster than it's ever have, right? We need to electrify, we need to get people access in those continents, while at the same time, we're creating these massive networks in preparation for what will be unprecedented energy demand as hyperscalers and AI continue to move forward, as we're trying to decarbonize these economies, ours included, in real time. To me, I mean, maybe I'm a little bit biased, it is the most exciting time ever to be in the economic policy game, both because of the national security nexus, but because of the room for innovation and opportunity. And so, BRI has gone through its own evolution. They have definitely, kind of shifted to small, beautiful, more focused projects, as they would say themselves. And for us, our objective is we want to see more investment. We want to see, for these important materials, more offtake opportunities, both for us and for them. And we want to see the same requirements that we have always said we wanted as part of our economic policy approach applied to everybody. And you can't do that, right, unless you have other offers on the table. So to me, the perfect outcome will be, as we continue to invest in the greenfield rail portion, and as rail lines like Tazara and the SGR go through their either building or refurbishments, that those rail lines are open access, that they are hiring local people, all of the same things we've been discussing, that they're thinking about investments along that infrastructure that supports communities and is enduring beyond building that rail. And most importantly, creating a space for an option for real interconnectivity, so we can really connect east to west, west to east, whatever way you want to say it, for the first time. That's us actually practically demonstrating the values we've been talking about for a long time. And something that, Jake Sullivan has said early on, Secretary Blinken has continued on, that economic competition, economic evolution is the idea of creating space, resiliency, and raising the bar. And there's no way to do that unless you're not investing as well.
I totally agree with you. And I think there's, I think one of the lines that struck me quite early when I moved to Washington was something Tanzanian Ambassador Elsie Kanza said, where she said, look, we want the best deal for our resources and for our countries. So the question is, how do we get the best value proposition to ensure that we're benefiting? Because we have historically not necessarily benefited in the way that we should. So it requires competition, like you said, is really healthy. One of the, I think, bedrocks also of the last 4 years is saying that new friends are important, right? Mm-hmm. We have historical friendshoring, but we have to walk with new friends. And I think that's what I feel really optimistic about is how we have leveraged our government instrument in Mozambique and Uganda looking at Tanzania and Zambia. And you really have seen Zambia is a perfect country to me to say, look at the investment that's come in when you've made the reforms, when you've brought some of this infrastructure development in. We know the next kind of front of infrastructure development is going to sit in energy because of the frequent droughts undermining kind of the hydropower there. So we see where the opportunities are, but we also see the private sector kind of taking advantage of that, acknowledging and going, hey, look, copper outlook is really great going forward because of AI, because of data centers. I think we're forecasted to go up by 1 million tons.
Yeah, copper outlook might be the only great outlook right now.
I know, we can come back to that, but
Totally.
I think that's well, to me, it's going, wow, the private sector is pulling back outside of copper massively.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so it's also saying, if we want to meet the needs of our future, we've got to reduce the cost of capital for these companies, because nobody's diving into nickel mining right now. If anything, we see them closing in Australia and New Caledonia. So, this is where a country like Tanzania becomes incredibly important, or Brazil. So, U.S. investors in particular, one of the things to me is we need to make these efforts bilaterally beneficial. We know African countries need to benefit, Asian countries, Latin American countries, but we also want the United States to benefit from these efforts. How have American investors responded to, for example, the Lobito Corridor project? Yeah,
I would say cautiously optimistic, right? And so you really hit on so many really important points. I think Zambia is a really interesting market to kind of dive into. And when we were talking about those parallel tracks, Zambia is the perfect example of a country who, has a lot to manage in its own political ecosystem and the types of, requests and interests that they have across multiple sectors, but often very much in the mining sector. And so they are, like any country, kind of battling in real time how to create the benefit for their people at home, but also keeping their market open to investment. And so they will continue to go through their own process of thinking about local content and how they're going to beneficiate part of their market for themselves, and learning from the rules and norms that have helped those sectors be successful. But that conversation could go in a very difficult path if they don't see investors in real time really optimizing the openness they have in this moment. And we've been working very closely with the companies that are on the ground, whether it's in Zambia like Cobalt, or other companies that are thinking about opening some of the first processing and refining capacity in Zambia. Or in Tanzania, when we were there, we made a big splash about Lifezone and BHP, not only because they're putting forward a huge amount of investment into the Kabanga nickel project, but because they're putting investment in Kahama, what's going to be one of the first special economic zones on the continent, we hope, that will be able not only to do local beneficiation and processing for that particular feedstock, but would have the capacity to grow and take feedstock from other parts and maybe beyond nickel in Tanzania, Burundi, other places, while having a very robust plan for training Tanzanians to operate those mines. So the US investor community is watching this, right? And they're seeing how much the US government, how much the Europeans, how much the Japanese as governments are putting in to help these projects get over the finish line. Both on, the stuff you probably know us best for, the political side of these issues, which is a huge part of this, but also the new ways we're trying to leverage our own products, whether that's creating special purpose vehicles that we can actually parallel invest in with a private developer, making it easier for ultimately these projects to be commercial when it comes time to do their commercial raise. And we're keeping that conversation incredibly active. So we spend a lot of time in New York, we spend a lot of time with the US financial institutions doing two things. One, educating them on how we've evolved, and most importantly, seeking advisement, right? Not only on the big issues that you probably will see all over New York at UNGA in 2 weeks around the things that we need to do with MDB evolution and creating just better meta tools, and thinking about how to deal with currency risk in these kind of bigger ways, but also in a very practical way of how you think about bringing in some of these companies that have maybe taken an exit from the continent back in to think that these infrastructure investments could be more attractive. And we're in a really interesting point with our Greenfield Rail project because we'll just be getting our feasibility results back in 2-3 weeks, right? That's going to be one of the first times that we're going to be able to sit down with private lenders and actually, with brass tacks, figure out what their opportunities could potentially look like. So it's taking things that were, policy areas and reforms and working on that, because you have to keep working on that, but then creating a space for a very practical test if we can make those transactions work. And I think that, obviously, if I was an optimistic person, I probably wouldn't be doing this work. But I've really enjoyed watching this process. And you have to remember, we're less than 2 years in. Mm-hmm. We've already mobilized over $4 billion in investment along that corridor. This is very fast for the U.S. government. Now we just have to keep that momentum up and really deliver on those private partners.
You mentioned keeping that momentum, and that's really important going forward. How do you view political risk, not just from the U.S. side, but even in some of these African countries? I think that one of the challenges with Tanzania, for example, is that the administration change yielded really positive policy development. But again, there's like a concern from investors that we hear that, like, what if we go back into resource nationalism? What if Zambia's administration changes? So right now I think there's a lot of very receptive governments, but there is a concern of electoral changes really across a number of these countries. And it's in investors' minds going, some of these countries made giant investments under previous administrations, and then the tide kind of turns electorally. How do we manage that?
Look, it's an excellent question. And I think how we've grappled with that, right? Because here's the issue, right? When we talk about these really complicated supply chains and we talk about infrastructure investment, we know these are 5 to 25 year long commitments to get them up, running, and really working in the way they need to. These timelines are really tough to operate in any political cycle, ours included. But we've had over 30 years of observation of what happens when we're not doing it, right? And the tide's not going to change to a more positive, opportunity set for private investors. I mean, the tides change all the time, and we're very happy with some of the reforms we're seeing, but it's not going to change if you're not there. And so we're taking that calculated kind of leap of faith that if we are focused and we don't try to make 1,000 flowers bloom all around the world, but say we're going to try this in a few places, we're going to put our resources in a way that we think is enduring by institutionalizing them into these projects, into these partnerships. And we're going to select partnerships that are truly mutually beneficial, meaning hopefully under any sort of regime change in these countries, there's going to be a benefit for them to utilize these investments. That's probably the most you can solve for. And I know that's not like a very popular policy response, but you can't solve for every eventuality. You have to create the space that you can keep iterating and protect those investments and create a space where you're all mutually in it. And when you're mutually in it, there's reason to continue. Same here in the US. If you were taking a look at what's happening right now, and I have to say the official US government officials do not comment on elections, but if we just take a look about what's happening here in the United States right now, the most bipartisan legislation that we're seeing come through that we hope will ultimately become part of different budget bills all around critical mineral security and partnerships and relationships. And they all have a role for international partners, just as much of the role that we have here at home to continue to move forward with permanent reform and making our sector as functional as possible. So these ways of thinking, I really do believe will be enduring, even if they tweak along the way. I think these broad concepts are really indicative of where the world is going.
So there's a point there I think that's really important too, is Africa's population is due to grow from 1.4 to 2.5 billion. It's going to be bigger than China. It's going to be bigger than India. Nigeria alone is going to be bigger than the United States. So it really is this prosperity on the continent is going to be closely linked to global prosperity. One of the things that gives me confidence and optimism per se is that when countries create jobs and investment, economic development, positive regimes are more likely to stay in power because ultimately we know that the electorate is wanting these jobs, right? So it's almost like a pilot project to say, look, if we crowd in our efforts into one project and it yields benefits, we can hopefully replicate that, on other parts of the continent, but also globally. I have two kind of final questions,
Sure.
So one is that, we've had flagship legislation in the last 4 years that have advanced our climate goals. We've had the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we've had the Inflation Reduction Act, which has catalyzed unparalleled investment, jobs in the United States. How do we export that model in a way? Like, how is PGI actually complementing those efforts, acknowledging, I always say from a minerals point of view, the U.S. does have less than 1% of nickel, cobalt, graphite, so we're not going to meet our domestic needs through domestic production alone. How does PGI complement these other measures that we've rolled out in the last 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, first off, Gracelin, your summary, maybe you should join our team. We'll take you on anytime. Because I think that ethos is really what's governing what we're doing. So just going back to, maybe the first things we were saying in the beginning of this conversation, I personally feel like PGI is the pilot test of how we export those values, those ways of investing, and putting the priority on decarbonized growth. Because one isn't going to work without the other. And the only way to do that is to demonstrate it can work. And I hope that as we demonstrate that it can work across the Trans-Africa Corridor, that it can work in the Philippines. And also, this isn't just, a USG brainchild. We have the G7 around us. We have other partners outside the G7 that are huge parts of these investments and on the private sector side. The more we can show that this works, the more places we can try to do this work. And better than all, the less will be needed to make it happen. That's how you actually take policy goals. And like I said, I spend years negotiating these policy goals. I will do anything to keep 1.5 alive. It's going to be really, really, really hard. But you have to get practical about it. That's why you're seeing the climate community move to a globalized posture as we're, figuring out how to implement the last bits of what the IRA is doing for us here. There's no question that this is a global issue and that we have to, deal with the existential challenges we have. We don't have a lot of time. There's a lot of growth. Not only is population growth happening, the young people in this world is going to be such a big part of that population, especially on the continent of Africa. We have to do the best to do all of it at the same time. And I think the only way you can do it is first demonstrating that it can work. Then we take it from there.
Absolutely. So I think my final question is this. We're up some of our U.S. government tools. We have a various tools in our toolkit. We have the DFC. We have EXIM. And some of these pieces of, these flagship efforts are really up for reauthorization. DFC next year, EXIM the following year. And so when some of these institutions were created, minerals were not necessarily at the forefront of our mind. We didn't really think about how vulnerable we were to supply chain disruptions. And I think these institutions get a bit too much grief sometimes for the fact that maybe they're not doing enough, but they weren't necessarily fit for purpose when they were created. How do we better leverage our tools? DFC has been a big part, obviously, of putting the money behind PGI in a way that's maybe not talked about enough. But how do we ensure with reauthorization that we can make these tools better fit for our goals abroad? Because in a way, when we have these conversations on the Hill, it's like, well, we have these tools, but they may not be deployed to maximum efficiency. So how do we ensure that we're taking a whole of government approach? We talk a lot about it domestically, but internationally.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is like the perennial question, right? How do you export a whole government approach, understanding that we're independent agencies that receive these requests and opportunities in different ways? And that is what PGI is striving to do. So we talked a lot about the international kind of side and the approach to the rest of the world and how we connect back to the US market. But part of our function is to also coordinate our interagency, specifically on infrastructure, not all things, to see a couple things. One, where are agencies already looking at similar projects and how do we optimize the great work they're doing in their own pipeline today? Then secondly, where do we strategically leverage our tools in order sometimes, right? To be able to stay with a project and a project pipeline from beginning to end. I don't think it's fair to ask any one agency to have the responsibility to do that. DFC has a very particular part in a project cycle when they can come in, but I'm sure they'd be delighted to influence projects earlier on. And so that's the role that other parts of our government can play for each other, whether that's U.S. aid on the front end, really understanding what's happening on the ground and making these longer term investments, or bringing USTDA and our feasibility tools with the confidence that we are creating the results that would allow a DFC or XM to come in. And I think that's a big part of our job. It's a big part of our own conversations on the Hill, as we are very, very much supporting the reauthorization of DFC and ultimately XM as well. And then along the way, making sure we have the right advisory funds, which is kind of a new thing that the Hill is grasping onto, to help fill those gaps so we're actually staying with a project from beginning to end, or in some cases, driving them. I think that's going to give everyone a lot more confidence in each one of our individual tools. At the same time, we would always like fixes. We'd always like more money, and we would absolutely like maximal flexibility. And I will let my various agency partners advocate upon themselves. But my job is to really focus on that connectivity, and we're going to keep working on it. It's going to take time. This is a new muscle memory, and I'm trying to stay away from the things you usually hear from government of creating one-stop shops and things like that, because I think it's actually way more complicated than that.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be at the World Bank. We love one-stop shops, but I can tell you sometimes it's decades on that we're still looking at the same one-stop shop.
I don't let anyone on my team say that term ever.
I think there's very wise. I think it's a buzzword that if we discarded, it wouldn't be the end of the world personally. I think the DRC is a great example of some of these things. Ambassador Lucy Tamlin, who I think is fantastic, she says, like, the tax reforms are really critical.
That's right.
And we hear it, from the minister as well, is saying, the tax reforms are central to making, starting to attract that investment. But so is infrastructure, right? So USAID might be helping with the tax reform, and PGII is working with the infrastructure, and Power Africa can be leveraged to address the fact that, it's 1% electrified. So it really does take a village, I don't, but if that's an okay term here, of U.S. government agencies to progress our goals, not just on a minerals front, but an economic development front, acknowledging, for example, that you are not going to attract private sector investment in any sector without energy. Right? So it really is that. Thank you so much for joining us. One of the things I love is everywhere I go, I see your name, right?
I hope it's mostly in a positive way.
It's always positive, right? But whether, we were at COP last year, or whether you're in the Congo, or whether you're in Asia.
Or you're in the Congo.
I mean, you were in the Congo like a week after me, right? They were like, oh, Helena's coming next week. I was like, great, Whether you're in Indonesia, what's exciting to me is that you and PGI are really viewed as the cornerstone of our international engagement from a development and infrastructure, a mineral security point of view. So thank you so much for joining us. I know you're incredibly busy. And for everybody who's watching, thank you so much for joining us. We've had people working very actively on the domestic policy front in recent years. So it's really exciting to me that we are going on and expanding into the people who are leading our international engagement. And it's a space that we are working on, and we're really excited to continue supporting. So thank you for joining us today.